hover over yourself and click on the dot, 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 and you see a small menu pop up. And if you'd like to rename yourself, you can absolutely do that.
I just did. I renamed myself Thor. Always
yeah, you can call yourself anything, however you'd like to be addressed. Dario will be Thor today.
I identify myself as Thor for this call.
The phone controls are a little bit different. I have yet to sort of figure those out.
Yeah.
But you get quite a lot of functionality on the computer in Zoom.
Absolutely. Again, for those people that are joining, it's Dario Camplatero with Summit Insurance. And we have Gina Weatherup from Chantilly Mediation. We're going to get started in just another minute or two. We encourage you to say hello as you're joining, and we'll get started in just a second. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and just get started with some housekeeping items as people are starting to join. Again, good morning, everybody. My name is Dario Camplatero. I'm the CEO and Managing Director for Summit Insurance Services in Leesburg, Virginia. We're part of Hill Group, national brokerage firm. And I'm proud to announce, I think today is probably our 12th or 13th weekly webinar that we started hosting in March. And I appreciate everybody's attendance and participation with these events. On our team, we've got Molly Carpenter, who's just done an amazing job in help coordinating and scheduling and emailing and surveys. So I appreciate Molly's contributions. And most importantly, I really appreciate all our speakers that we've had today. We've got an exciting speaker, Gina Weatherup from Chantilly Mediation. She's going to be talking to us in just a second. And I want to encourage everybody to certainly ask questions. You can use the chat feature. Gina, I'm sure will give plenty of opportunity for everybody to either introduce themselves or ask questions. So we want to encourage that. Also, some other housekeeping items. At the end of the presentation, you'll be getting a follow-up email from Molly Carpenter on our team. I'm sorry, Molly Jackson on our team. She'll be sending out a copy of the presentation with the recording. And then Gina will also probably be following up. And also to keep in mind that over the next few weeks, we've got speakers really in the queue through almost the end of August. So we'll be sending out a schedule of those events. But for these webinars, we generally send out invites on Tuesdays and Thursdays for Friday events. We're trying to be considerate of not peppering you too much with emails about our events. But just so you know our scheduling, we're doing Fridays at 11 for the month of August. And look for those invites. We hope you can attend more of our meetings. So with that, Gina Weatherup's going to be presenting today from Chantilly Mediation. Gina and I have known each other a few years. I've had her, had the pleasure of hearing her speak a couple times, and really has an interesting take on various topics. And the one today is very interesting. And then I think she'll probably tease maybe a future topic on emotional EQ as possibility.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to participate in today's call, obviously, but if there's any follow-up, any questions, anything that either myself or Gina can do, I encourage you to reach out. We're here to help you guys. And more importantly, Gina's the professional here when it comes to this particular topic. Feel free to reach out to her directly for additional support and resources. So with that, Gina, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here this morning. And actually, Dario, to your last point, I just in the chat right now, and I will do this again later in the presentation, shared my email address. So the folks at Summit Insurance are recording this session. And I always like to make things a little bit more interactive, especially online, to get people kind of talking with each other. But if you have something that you don't want to have recorded for posterity and you think that I can help you out, please reach out to me. It's just gina@chantillymediator.com. I'm going to pull up my share screen briefly here, and this does actually, again, list my email address, just to kind of introduce the topic. And then I'd love to go around and have folks share a little bit about what you might be struggling with right now. So my name's Gina Weatherup. And this presentation this morning focuses on empathy and how and why to manage and lead teams with empathy. So I came to this topic several years ago when I started to study happiness at work. How can we create happier workplaces? So the whole reason I founded my company is to help leaders build happier workplaces, both because I really believe that we all spend way too much time working to not feel happy and fulfilled at work. And then also because I started to learn that the happier employees are, the more productive they are, and the more profitable our companies are, which I think is just a wonderful tidbit. And we'll talk a little bit more about the science behind that in this presentation this morning. I am a trained mediator, so I provide conflict resolution to workplaces, and I also train people on emotional intelligence. So that's where the empathy piece really comes in. It's understanding people and managing kind of kindly. But I thought that it might be really useful this morning to start with the question of, what have you been struggling with lately? I don't know how many of you actually manage employees or lead teams, but we're sort of struggling through a global pandemic right now, right? It's unprecedented. So I'm gonna stop the share screen for a moment and encourage you all to come into gallery view so we can see each other. A lot of people don't have their video on. That's okay. Feel free to turn it on if you're comfortable doing so. I'm just gonna pause for a minute and ask, what are the things that have been difficult for you, particularly if you're managing a team, but what has been difficult for you at work lately?
I'll start. This is Karen Smith with the ARC of Greater Prince William. I think we do a very good job of managing with empathy, but how do you balance that with staff meeting expectations?
That's a good question.
Sometimes you can do all you want with the empathy, but people have got to also produce, and then it gets a little bit lax so that people think, oh, well, I can just do about, so there's a balance there. So we need help with the balance.
Okay, thank you. And if you see me looking down or looking at sort of to the side here, I have a 2-screen setup, and I'm also a compulsive note taker. So I'm just making a note of Karen's question about how do you balance empathy with having staff meet expectations. And we've got a few more people joining us right now, so I'll just say welcome. My name is Gina Weatherup, and I am a trained mediator. I use empathy and active listening when I help people resolve conflict, and I wanted to start today's presentation by asking about what people might be struggling with. Karen just shared with us from the ARC that she thinks they do a pretty good job of managing with empathy, but they struggle with the balance of helping staff to actually stay on target and meet their expectations. Is there anyone else who would like to share with us something you've been struggling with in terms of managing people during this COVID pandemic?
Maybe I can add a comment to piggyback on Karen's. I think there's a lot of empathy generally in the business community right now, really from everybody, understanding we're in an unusual circumstance, but transitioning back to, I don't know, normal is the right word, but there will be a point where the job at hand has to get done. And there's empathy and there's kind of transitional consideration, but there will be a point where that will have to stop, and it has to get back to a more regular work environment, I think. But again, it's hard to predict. That doesn't necessarily mean in the office. It just means something more, more buttoned up, maybe. I don't know.
Potentially, yeah, absolutely. One of the things I like to talk about is to touch on the idea that we sort of have a stereotype a little bit of what a professional is, and it sort of is a person who doesn't have emotions usually, which is kind of impossible for human beings to be consistently over time. I'll just pause very quickly and see if anyone else has something that they would like to share in terms of something that has been difficult with managing staff recently for you. Okay, so I'm going to come into my screen share again, And Karen and Dario, I almost called you Thor, Dario. Hope that we get a little bit into how to manage the staff expectations. But I want to just start with learning objectives. And we'll see if we can add this idea of, is there a balance to be had between empathy and encouraging staff to actually meet their expectations as we go through, and I'll make a note to be sure to revisit that at the end. First of all, I want us to define empathy. A lot of people think they know what it is, and I myself have actually learned that in psychology there are different types of empathy, and it's important to understand what the differences are, because I think it's helpful to know that in order to actually be able to use it at work. Understand why it helps you with managing people, why empathy helps you. Learn how to grow empathy. One of the things I've come across since I started my business and started talking about empathy at work is that there are many people who think that empathy is great, but you're either born with it or you're not. And that is actually a myth. Empathy is a skill that we can grow. And we will have a discussion toward the end of our hour here together about how to use empathy at work, because I've got lots of ideas about it, but if my ideas don't ring true for your work environment, they won't work for you. So I want to sort of pool our knowledge in the room, if you will, and kind of discuss a little bit what might work well. Please feel free to ask questions throughout this presentation. I'm happy to pause, and you'll see this slide a few times in the presentation where I kind of remind myself to pause and ask. But you don't have to wait for this screen. You can open up the chat box, which should probably be in the menu at the bottom of your screen. It might be up at the top. It might be hidden under the 3 dots that say more. But you can open up the chat box and go ahead and type in any question you may have. So don't hold back on questions. So let's just jump into empathy. And let me figure out how to advance my slide. There we go. So what is empathy? Empathy is understanding, being sensitive to, or experiencing another person's feelings or their perspective. So what I find fascinating about empathy, and the reason I always want to start with kind of helping everyone to understand exactly what the definitions, plural, are, is that there's actually 2 types of empathy. There's cognitive empathy and there's affective empathy. So we're going to start with affective empathy, which is also called emotional empathy. And this is kind of what most people think about when they think empathy. It's sort of that phrase of, I feel your pain, right? So affective empathy is actually feeling someone else's feelings, which means it is involuntary. It just happens. And we are more likely to feel this with people with whom we feel a deeper connection. So someone who's in your family or a best friend, someone with whom you have a deep connection. Couple of examples, there's sort of that stereotype of the mom who cries at the Hallmark commercial. She sees something happening that's deeply touching and she responds in kind with that same feeling, and there are tears. Another example here that I like to use is if you've ever walked into a room and there are already people in the room who are laughing about something, and you might feel yourself grinning and maybe even laughing, but you have no idea what the joke is. That's also affective empathy. So it's just actually feeling the feelings that someone else has. However, particularly at work, when you think about managing people, I think it's important to know that there's this whole other route to feeling empathy, and that is cognitive empathy, which is voluntary. We can choose to engage in cognitive empathy or not. And what it is actually making an effort to think about someone else's perspective, okay? To use your imagination to try to guess at what someone else might be feeling or why they might be behaving that way. Now, when I mediate cases, I often will ask people individually, and we have the sort of one-on-one discussion, well, why do you think that person might have behaved that way? Just imagine for a second that they are just as kind, smart, intelligent, logical as you are, and think about what could make them behave in this way that might be difficult for you. You know, it's using your imagination to kind of think about why someone else might do or say or think what they are doing or saying or thinking. So Under empathy, we've got cognitive empathy, which is voluntary and kind of using your imagination. We've got affective empathy, which is involuntarily actually feeling the feeling that someone else is feeling. The route that we want to follow empathy through to get to is actually compassion. So I'm going to pause for a moment right there. We're going to talk more about compassion very soon. But let me just ask right off the bat, does anyone have any questions or comments at this point? All right, let's move forward. What is compassion? I think a lot of you might be thinking, I know what compassion is, Gina, but I think it's important to just quickly review that compassion is both a feeling and an action. Okay, so compassion is a response to empathy. It is wanting to help someone to alleviate what they might be struggling with or suffering from. And this can happen at work in a variety of ways, right? Sometimes it's actually something that is very much work related, where you're struggling to meet a challenge that you don't necessarily have the skill set for, or you haven't been trained on, and it's difficult to do. But it can happen in our personal lives, and then it affects us at work, right? Something when there is a natural disaster, when there is a pandemic and kids are suddenly home from school and you can't leave your house, when you experience the death of a loved one. These are times that something really important and deep is happening in your life outside of work. And we're human beings. We can't just shut that off when we're working, right? We carry all of that with us all of the time. And so the compassion might be, how do I help you in this time of need? How do I sit with you? How do I help to make things a little bit lighter, a little bit easier on you? So compassion is sort of two steps. It's I see or feel or understand your pain or your struggle, and I feel moved to help you. I want to do something, and I take an action to try to help you. So when we talk about managing people with empathy, it's really a route to try to get to compassion and helping the people that we're managing, right? As managers, we're not just there to sort of do the substantive work and try to hit profitable goals. We're really there to help our teams to do the best that they can do for whatever the purpose is for your own company, whether that's helping people to have insurance, helping people to access services, selling products that people need, whatever it may be. You are there, you do the work for a purpose, and the empathy and the compassion is to help your team to achieve that. So let's talk about this even more explicitly. Empathy and compassion at work, how does this play out for a manager? You're talking with someone, you see or feel and understand their emotion, that's the empathy piece. And you want to help them and you offer them some sort of help, that's the compassion piece. So I'm going to pause again. I know this section, this whole part of the presentation so far is pretty theoretical. I'm going to get into some of the evidence that we actually have that this stuff is important in a workplace, and also start to talk a little bit about active listening as well. Does anyone have any questions or comments so far?
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Some people seem to get stuck on the empathy side and maybe don't have the compassion to help, or some people skip over the empathy side and go right to helping. It seems human nature. Sometimes people are just programmed that way. Is there any comments on that, Gina?
Absolutely. And in fact, that is in some ways a wonderful step forward into talking about active listening. So, I'm going to toss up a slide here that comes a little bit later in my presentation. This might be familiar. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Stephen Covey. Right. So, it is, as you said, maybe a little bit of human nature. I find that I do this a lot with my children. I want to just skip ahead to making it better for them. Here's the solution. That's what you do. it's really not helpful in some cases to do that, right? Whether we're talking about kids or whether we're talking about people that we work with, really understanding what someone is going through is a first step to getting to a solution that will be most appropriate for them. And then, of course, also talking about emotional intelligence, talking about feelings. Sometimes people don't need you to give them a solution. Sometimes people just want to share, well, this is what I'm struggling with right now. And maybe by talking it through with you, talking out loud, I can come up with my own solution. Or maybe I just want you to have a window into why a project is taking longer than you think it should, but I still want to learn the steps and get to it, to learn to do it on my own successfully.
Thanks.
So one of the things that we know is empathy and compassion actually are really important at work. And there are, oops, let me come up a couple of slides here. In general, there have been many studies that either look broadly at emotional intelligence or look specifically at managers using empathy or compassion in their team management. And the more frequently that is used, the more success we see for individual contributors, for individual managers, for teams, and for companies. So I'm just going to go through some of the specific correlations that have been found in different studies. So when managers manage with empathy, their own productivity increases and their own performance ratings increase. Now, part of why that happens is when managers use empathy or compassion at work, they're helping their employees to be more responsive, to produce higher quality work, to make improvements. In some studies, they have found that managers using empathy have higher safety rates on their teams. Other studies have found that when managers use empathy, or when a whole company is rated as highly empathetic, people have a higher level of job satisfaction and a higher commitment or loyalty to staying with that organization. Remember, people don't leave jobs, they leave managers, right? So if your manager is behaving kindly with you and you feel a deep connection, the kind of thing that we get when someone is empathetic or compassionate with us, we feel more deeply that we want to stay and keep working with that person. And some studies have actually found that highly empathetic teams and organizations are more profitable. It kind of stands to reason if you think about it. Having the empathy and the compassion at work leads to stronger interpersonal connections, which builds a stronger team. You see greater employee engagement and stronger collaboration. So teams are working together in a higher quality way, working together more frequently, trusting each other, that if they do happen to maybe try something new and make a mistake, somebody's got their back on the team, right? Or if they are struggling with something at home, they don't necessarily have to hide it at the workplace. They can actually share it and figure out how can we still continue to be productive in the workplace, despite the fact that my own individual productivity might go down for the short term. So all of these things mean that teams have a stronger commitment to the shared goals, and that leads to a higher level of performance, which then in turn leads to that higher level of profitability. So managing with empathy really does help the organization's bottom line and revenue streams. I'm going to pause once again. We are doing really well on time here, so I can stop and answer questions, or we can save our time to kind of have a deeper discussion toward the end of the hour that we're sharing together here. So one of the best ways to grow the skill of empathy is to use active listening. And as a mediator, this is how I understand what conflicts exist when I'm called upon to help people resolve a conflict, so that I can help them kind of get to a great end result and resolution. Active listening is simply listening to understand. And I'm going to share with you one of my most favorite quotations, which is from Michael Shurtleff, who was a casting director. So he's coming from the world of acting. Listening is not merely hearing, it is receiving the message that is being sent to you. Listening is being affected by what you hear. Listening is letting it land before you react. Listening is letting your reaction make a difference. Listening is active. So when he says listening is being affected by what you hear, that's empathy. And when he says listening is letting your reaction make a difference, that really is talking about compassion. And I actually just received a question asking what is the most appropriate way for a manager to find out if employees feel that they are being managed with empathy? I think that's a wonderful question. And I'll be honest with you, I actually have not received that question before, but it's a really important one to think about. What I would suggest is that doing anonymous employee surveys can be very helpful in this respect. I also think that sometimes there's sort of a feeling when you are in a team environment and you're able to kind of check in with people physically in the same space, you can feel whether people are generally happy or generally a little bit like kind of, I don't want to say unhappy, but feeling like they need to keep their head down and work hard because they don't want to share too much or be seen as kind of getting out of line a little bit. So sometimes there's a little bit of a feeling that you can pick up on. But the best thing to do is really to ask directly. And people don't always feel comfortable doing that unless they really believe that the answers are going to be kept confidential or anonymous. Now that gets difficult in smaller workplaces, but one way to try to get around that is to do online surveys and actually really keep the answers anonymous and only look at sort of in the aggregate, what did the total responses say to us? That kind of gets a little bit in my brain back to the question that I believe it was Karen who started us off with, asking, well, how do you balance the empathy with having people meet their expectations? So there's sort of a, I almost want to say a cycle here that you can think about, right? Because the empathy is just the first step. It's part of active listening. It's trying to understand where someone is coming from. And then being open and honest with them as a manager about, well, what we need you to do is here. And what I'm hearing you say is that you can't get there and you're stuck over here. So how do we bridge this gap? And asking them for their feedback or making suggestions about how to get there. And then really listening to them in terms of, does that feel like it's going to be helpful to you or not? Now, different situations play out differently, right? We're human beings, people react in different ways. You might have somebody who says, well, that's not what I need. And it turns out that really is what they need, whatever training, for example, that the manager suggested. Or you might have someone who says, that's not what I need. And it's actually true that whatever they think they need will make the difference to get them to where they need to be, right? So it's hard to talk about these things in really general terms, but hopefully towards the end, we can talk a little bit more specifically if people are willing to share sort of specific ideas and examples. And I can think about some more resources to share with you as well. So let's think about, again, this idea that, here we go. Most people don't listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply. And unfortunately, if you as a manager are doing this with your team members, you're kind of missing out on understanding what they're actually struggling with, both at work and at home, that they might be carrying with them to work, right? So active listening is listening to understand. It's not listening to offer a solution or listening to try to reply or listening to try to correct. It's listening to understand what it is they're going through. And that's the first step toward being able to get to the appropriate solutions or help them to improve in whatever way they need to improve. So again, I want to give you sort of the tools to advocate for empathy at work. So let's go back over, why is this important at work? Active listening is one of only a handful of activities that has been proven to increase your empathy skills. So empathy is something that all human beings have, but it's also a growable skill. So different people sort of have different natural set levels for empathy. Some of us feel it more easily than others, but the more that you engage in active listening, the more that you can grow that ability and feel it more deeply. And remember, there's two types of empathy. The more that you use active listening, the better your cognitive empathy skills become as well. The better you get at guessing at what someone else's experience might actually be. So by using active listening at work, we grow our empathy skills. We strengthen our social ties amongst the team members, everyone that we work with, which increases employee engagement. So the question is, how do you do this thing called active listening? I think a lot of people have heard of the phrase before. You might have understood before. I said it earlier today, that active listening is listening to understand. But I think really explicitly setting out specific steps can be very important as well. So the first thing is actually kind of a difficult thing. I can say it to you, but I can't necessarily help you to do it. It is to suspend judgment. So I believe that a lot of us culturally just have a lot of judgment and evaluations. There's sort of these voices in the back of our heads that are always saying an evaluation. Sometimes it's about ourselves, sometimes it's about other people. You kind of have to figure out your own ways to turn that volume down on the judgment, right? The best advice I can give you to do this well is to assume that what this person is saying to you is true. Now, there may be situations in life where you come across people who want to lie to you, who want to deceive you. That's rare. It does happen. Active listening is not going to help you with those folks. Being empathetic and compassionate, they're out to sort of swindle you, as one of my former clients used to say. And there's not much you can do about that. You can call in a mediator. You can go a more disciplinary route. But for the most part, in general terms, when we talk about managing people, assuming what they tell you is true is actually really beneficial for you and them. So in other words, even if what someone says to you sort of doesn't resonate, you're thinking, well, that client's never behaved that way with me. Or you're thinking, well, that just seems like wrong. Just stop that evaluation for a moment, take a breath, pause, and assume, okay, well, even if that hasn't been my experience, that's what this person is telling me is their experience. So let me imagine for a moment, kind of employ that cognitive empathy, the voluntary one that we can choose to engage in. Let me employ that for a moment. Suspend my judgment, stop evaluating, and just assume that what this person is sharing with me is true from their perspective. The second piece is to really focus. So what I advocate for managers to do is to schedule focused time with the people who report to them and let those folks know that this is their time to share whatever they'd like to be sharing, what they're struggling with, what they're going through. It's their uninterrupted time with you. So focus might mean closing out your email browser or turning the ringer down on your phone, or literally turning away from the screen so that you can actually have the phone conversation, or in a different world, if you're working in an office, to actually really focus your physical body toward that person so that you can kind of clue your mind in that this is where my attention is. I'm focusing on this person right now. And of course, you have to listen to them. And it's really helpful to repeat back the things that you're hearing them say. This helps them to feel like you hear them. And it also gives you the opportunity to check in on your understanding, right? You might be paraphrasing, you might be summarizing, you might be reflecting back actual words, and they will have the opportunity to say, yeah, exactly. Or no, that's not what I meant, right? That's okay. It's all data, it's all information. You're trying to understand where they're coming from. And if you repeat back what they said and they're like, no, well, there's a reason that they're correcting themselves, right? So it's all data, it's all information toward trying to understand where they're coming from. The last idea kind of goes back to that quote from Michael Shurtleff about letting the information you're hearing land with you, right? So it's digest what you really hear. And then you might want to start asking some questions, right? So the purpose of asking questions can be a few different things. You might just need to clarify. When I'm mediating cases, I find I do this a lot. I'm like, wait, I don't understand. Can we go back? What does that acronym mean? Or, well, what did you do in between this thing and this thing? I want to understand what's going on. So I might need to ask clarifying questions. Might also want to ask open-ended questions. So some folks, especially maybe if you're trying out managing with empathy for the first time and this hasn't been something you've really thought about or done much before, you might need to really help people, sort of give them the opportunity and the feeling that they can share more. So you want to ask open-ended questions, right? You want to ask things like, so an open-ended question, I'll define it, is any question that can be, that has to be answered by more than just yes or no, right? Like, did you clock in? Yes, no. That's a close-ended question. Open-ended question. Has it been, well, let me think for a minute. An open-ended question might be, how do you feel about our time and attendance policies? An open-ended question might be, what do you think of that client? Questions that you can't say yes or no to, you have to, in order to answer them, give a little more information. That's an open-ended question. My favorite way to use an open-ended question, or my favorite phrase, is not a question. I simply say, tell me more. It's an invitation for them to share whatever they think might be interesting or important for me to know without my kind of leading them in a specific direction. I'll pause for a moment. Did someone have a question? Okay. The other thing that you can do when you're asking is ask them whether they'd like some help or a solution or an idea or advice. Sometimes people don't want that. And if you skip ahead into that, you might be kind of making them feel more like, well, this isn't helping me. I came across a statistic the other day that only 23% of employees feel that their manager's feedback is relevant to them. So 3/4 of employees are getting feedback that they don't think is important to them or relevant to them or useful to them. So asking someone if they'd like help, and then if they say yes, offering that solution can be very beneficial because you kind of get an idea of, do they even want this feedback? Now, of course, I'm talking about a workplace in management. There's going to be times where you need to give feedback. And in that particular case, I think the best thing to do is just be really honest with people about, look, I need to give you this feedback. It may not be what you want to hear. So you just kind of caveat it a little bit. But it's important that I let you know X, Y, Z. But asking people generally whether they'd like help or want a solution or advice is a good step once you've confirmed that you kind of understand what they're talking about. You can also ask someone, well, how can I help you with this, right? So you might want to say, someone's struggling with you, they've fallen behind on a project, you're having a conversation about it, you're trying to understand why and how they've fallen behind. Ask them, what are the tools you need? How can I help you to get this project back on track? So the 4 steps I'm talking about here with active listening have been to not judge people, right? Suspend that judgment, don't evaluate, really assume what they're telling you is true. Focus on the conversation that you're having with them. Listen and repeat back some of what you hear, and to digest and ask, right? Let it land with you, take a moment to understand, and start to ask different questions. So at this point, I want to pause again for questions, and we're toward the end of my formal presentation here, so we can really open up discussion. And I have a couple different things that we can try out for that, but let me just stop the share for a moment here and see what questions people might have, or if there are specific topics that you would like to spend the next 10 minutes or so discussing.
Gina, maybe I can get the wheels moving a bit. I had, in my previous employer, I had a boss. Our company was very big on active listening.
Yeah.
Did a lot of training on it. However, it got stuck in the listening part, meaning, you know, that's where the conversation usually ended. And I think part of the training we went through, that the active listening, as the active listener, you would allow the person who was talking to you to resolve their own issue through talking without saying anything back. is there some advice there in there? Is that an accurate depiction of some form of active listening, or is that just maybe coming up short on the full circle of what's
Actually, I love that question. One of the exercises I do when I'm actually in a room with people, and I have done it in Zoom if we want to get into breakouts, is you actually you're paired up. One person tells a story for about 2 minutes. The other person doesn't say a word. And when we're in a room together, what I ask that person who's listening to do is put their hand in the air briefly and then bring it back down every time their mind wanders. So they say something and you suddenly want to share something where you've had a similar experience, or they're talking about a vacation and you went to the same place as them and you really want to jump in and tell them about that. Or they're talking about a client who annoys them and, oh my gosh, the same client said the same thing to you and you really want to jump in and say that. Those are not active listening. They're ways we relate to get to each other, and there's nothing wrong with those types of conversations. But if you're managing people and you need to build that deeper connection to grow your team trust and collaboration, you want to not always be having conversations like that, right? So the key is to listen to understand, which is the type of active listening that I've been talking about. Verify that you really get it by repeating back to them, saying, okay, this is what I hear you saying. Help me understand if I'm getting it right. And then ask them, listen, is this a situation where you need me to step in? Is there something that you would like for me to do to help? Let them answer that question. And if they say no, or I'm really not sure, go with, okay, well, I have some advice. If you have advice, would you like to hear it? Or do you want to take some more time to kind of figure this out on your own, assuming it's a situation where you can do that, right? I'm kind of thinking back to Karen's question in the beginning here about balancing the empathy and the staff expectations. We're managers, right? We get to a point where we need to say to somebody, look, you're not getting it. You're not at the productivity level we need you to be at. And those conversations can be a little bit different, right?
Right.
The active listening, I believe, still plays an important role because it's really understanding where they're coming from and what exactly is holding them back. But what your expectations are should be in black and white in writing somewhere. And if you need to review that with someone, then you need to review that with someone. And the active listening is really just about, do you understand these expectations? Do you understand what happens if you don't meet them? How can I help you to meet them? And having that conversation. I don't know if that's helpful.
Absolutely. No, it's absolutely helpful. I appreciate it.
Sure.
How about from the rest of the group? Anybody want to jump in on a question? I don't know if we're seeing anything on chat, or, I'll try to be quiet for a minute and give somebody else a chance to ask something. Feel free.
I see a couple people coming off of mute, but I'm not hearing anything. Kirsten or Eileen, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So I'm going to share in the chat a link, and this is going to work best for people who are on a computer this morning. It is a link to a Google document that is set public, so anyone can go ahead and edit it. And if you're able to follow that link and you come down into slide number 2, actually 2, 3, and 4. See, now, again, this is sort of like translating what I do in a room with people into the online setting. If we were in a room together, I would probably have some flip charts. I'd have some different questions up on the flip charts. I'd have you all talk in your own tables to answer the question, and then walk around to see what other people had written on their flip chart for their question. So in the Google document on slide 2 is the question of what are some ways that you can use empathy at work today, or this week, sort of for yourself. The next question is, how can you encourage maybe your executives or your peers to think about empathy at work? Why might it be important? What might you say to them? And then the third piece is thinking about the system of your company. What are some ways to help your company or to create a more empathetic company, right? So what I want to invite you to do, and I think we've got about 4 people over in this Google document, is to just kind of think about what are some of the the things that I would say to answer this question. And you can answer all three, you can answer one. It's anonymous. I'm happy to share these slides when we share my PowerPoint slides after this presentation. And if you can't access that, but you wanna come off mute and share your thoughts, or you wanna put an answer into the group chat, please, that is absolutely cool. You should totally do that. So the first question is, what are some ways that you can use empathy at work today? And the link to that is actually in the group chat. Oh, Karen has to leave early. Thank you for participating, Karen. I hope that you found it useful. So one of the, this is not an example from one of my own clients, but it's actually from a book, and I'll share the resource in the chat. I'll put in the title and the authors there. It's called Awakening Compassion at Work. And one of the stories that they relate is someone who has always been seen as a model employee in her company. She's been there 10 plus years, so she has seniority. And suddenly she starts to have attendance issues. And it gets to the point where the folks in HR alert her manager. They're like, dude, this girl's past 3 strikes, you're out. We need to fire her. And the manager's like, wait. What's going on? And he sits down with her and he talks to her. And he kind of notices that she seems to be going through something, but he has no idea what it is. And he asks her about it. And she shares that her husband, I forget exactly what the illness is, but he's in need of an organ transplant. So he's had a ton of different medical appointments. Sometimes the appointments happen at the last minute. Sometimes she has no idea how long she has to be in the hospital with him. So this has clearly affected her ability to be at work. Now, originally she didn't want to share this because she didn't want to feel like people were pitying her. And she also didn't want people to assume that she couldn't do her job, right? Because when she was at work, she was still producing. She just couldn't be there as frequently. So the supervisor asked her permission to share what was going on. And when she said, okay, if you think that's best, what happened is her whole team started to respond more compassionately. So the supervisor obtained a waiver from HR in terms of being able to keep her employed despite the fact that she'd had X number of absences. And her teammates responded in a variety of compassionate ways. So there were some folks who, there's one person who happens to live in the same neighborhood as her and just started dropping by with casseroles. But there are other folks who reached out to her and said, hey, listen, I know you might have to be out quickly, so do you mind if we work together for this particular client? And then if you're out, I'll know what needs to be done so that the client still gets what they need from us. So these are different ways to sort of help to alleviate some of the suffering she's going through when she's going through something that's really important and kind of deep in her personal life that has been affecting her job. The compassion started with noticing that something was up, with actively listening to try to understand and give this employee the space to share it in a private conversation, and then to share what was going on so that they could both adjust policies and make sure they were being there for their clients and give people the opportunity to just be a friend to this particular work colleague. So I'll share in the chat. This book is called Awakening Compassion at Work. So I'm seeing some responses in our Google document about using empathy at work to listen better and be more focused and appreciate that people have things going on. Absolutely. One of the basic ideas behind empathy at work is to understand that, you know, when we bring our whole selves to work, there's stuff going on that's sometimes unrelated to work. Thinking about encouraging executives to think about empathy, people are sharing it's important to push pause on the judgment, to start with a clean slate regardless of history. Focus on understanding your employees' needs and feelings. Ask employees if they feel like they're being managed with empathy. I do, again, as I said earlier, kind of encourage people to do that on a more anonymous or confidential basis. If it can come via a SurveyMonkey or one idea that I've had that I've yet to have a client do is after people leave, when you're conducting exit interviews, ask how they felt about how they were managed at that point, because they might feel more able to be honest, either on their way out the door, or some companies conduct the exit interviews after they've left. So they really feel safer to say, yeah, it was like this when I was there, so that you kind of understand generally how people felt. I love this comment on slide number 3, focus equals respect. It absolutely does. When someone calls you and they hear you typing away in the background while you're having the conversation, they don't feel like you care about them. That's the opposite of managing with empathy. But if you're in the middle of something that is urgent and time sensitive, you can say to them, look, I'm so sorry. I want to be able to give you my full attention. I need to get this thing done. It's going to take me X amount of time, 2 minutes, half an hour, whatever. Can I call you back? You can absolutely do that. Most of the time people are going to respond really well because they're like, oh, you want to be able to focus on me. That sounds good. Yes, I'd like your full attention. So yes, we'll talk about it then. And if it's time sensitive on their end, they're going to let you know at that point too. And when we think about using empathy at work, sort of in the systems, and how can your company become more empathetic, we have, yes, have one-on-ones. Please schedule weekly one-on-ones with your employees. This is incredibly important. And just ask them to let you know what's going on. Ask them what their goals are. Ask them, you know, questions about like, how do they want to be seen in this company? What's going on in their life right now? How are they doing, you know, if they're stuck at home, and what month are we in? Month 4 of staying at home? You know, what's going on for them? And then kind of be quiet and just listen. Create an environment of communication. This is important. The feeling behind the communication is really important, right? What's the tone? Are you constantly communicating, but it's always directive? Or are you asking people to share with you what's going on and listening when they answer rather? Ask employees how they feel, create a culture of openness. So opportunities for feedback should be open, absolutely. And feedback is something that we could do a whole separate presentation on, because how and when you give feedback is really important. It should pretty universally be always done sort of in the moment. So I'm gonna share these slides with Dario and Molly along with the PowerPoint presentation. I wanna pull up the presentation real quickly again. And just take me a moment to get there, I'm sorry. There's just one more thing that I wanted to offer to you, and that is that because you joined us today, I am very happy to give you a half-hour consultation for free. Usually I have a $200 an hour charge. There would be zero charge for this, just to understand for where you are individually, what your company does, what are your goals, how might I be able to help? My specialty, again, is resolving conflict, empathy, emotional intelligence. I actually have a new offering now. I've become certified in a particular emotional intelligence assessment that also helps people better understand how they manage stress and how they make decisions. And that's something that Dario and I were just talking about doing a separate hour-long presentation on, so that you can kind of understand what that is and how it might be helpful. So if you'd like to set that up, please go ahead and contact me. It's Gina@chantilly-mediator.com, and I'll type that into the chat again. You can ask me any questions at all via email. We can schedule that free consultation for you. Or if you'd like, you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn or check out my website. And I'll share those links in the chat as well.
Great, Gina. I really appreciate it. That was a great presentation. A couple things that I took away. Listening, focus means respect. I think it's a really good one, where I know I'm the worst culprit sometimes, especially when we're in the office and I've got 2 screens and a phone in my hand and one device.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, that's an area where I can improve on. I thought that was really interesting. I think the emotional intelligence presentation, we'll definitely talk about putting that in the queue. for the fall. Again, I think that's an underrated or maybe not, the awareness on that is lower than maybe other issues.
Mm,
Really the thing that resonated with me is it's something that can be changed. Right?
absolutely.
Personalities can't, but your EQ, you can work on that. And then finally, as far as presentations, your ability to embed that Google Doc where we could type and all that stuff, really cool. I didn't know that could.
Awesome.
So, your expertise in managing a Zoom webinar is quite impressive. So good work on that too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So with that, folks, we're going to wrap things up. Again, Molly Jackson on my team will be distributing the presentation, a copy of the recording, and Gina's contact information. We encourage you to reach out to Gina. I thank her so much for offering up a free consultation. That's not a small thing to offer. I can tell you my experience is the presentations are useful, maybe. It's really the consultant that makes that material come alive. So I would encourage people to reach out to her and have those one-on-one
I would
conversations.
love to talk more with people. Please, please reach out to me.
And with that, I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. We're going to end this meeting at 5 minutes early and give people a little bit more time in their day. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming and participating and trying out that Google Doc link. Appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.